That morning began with a victory I had fought 6 long and grueling months to achieve. I was sitting on the crinkly paper of the examination table in Dr. Miller's office, buttoning up my shirt, with hands that were finally steady. The doctor, a man who had seen me at my absolute worst, was smiling warmly from across the room. He patted my shoulder and told me my heart was strong, my blood pressure was perfect, and the physical therapy had worked absolute miracles. I had fully recovered from the mild stroke that had knocked me off my feet back in February. I was 70 years old, but in that moment, I felt like I had been handed a brand new lease on life. I remember pulling my phone out of my jacket pocket to check the time, planning to treat myself to a good steak lunch to celebrate my clean bill of health. Instead of the time, a bright red notification from my banking app was waiting on the screen. It was an automated security alert. I tapped it, expecting maybe a routine fraud check or a cleared payment. The app opened, the screen loaded, and then the breath completely left my lungs. My retirement account, the account I had spent 40 exhausting years building dollar by painful dollar, the account that held exactly $1.2 million, displayed a balance of $0.00. Before my brain could even begin to process the numbers, before the rising panic could even reach my throat, the phone vibrated in my palm. It was an incoming call from Stephanie, my daughter, my only child. I answered on the first ring, my voice shaking just a little as I tried to form the words to tell her that the bank had made some catastrophic error. But I did not get the chance to speak a single word. "Dad," her voice came through the speaker. It was not the warm, loving voice of a daughter talking to her father. It was flat. It was cold. It was entirely calculating. "My wedding is tomorrow. I took all the money from your account, and I sold the house. Good luck." Click. The line went dead. I sat there in the sterile silence of the examination room, the dial tone humming against my ear like a swarm of hornets. For a few agonizing seconds, the world simply stopped spinning. I pulled the phone away and stared at the dark screen. The call had lasted exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds for my own flesh and blood to wipe out my entire existence and discard me like trash. If you are listening to this right now, and you have ever felt the knife of betrayal plunged into your back by the very people you sacrificed everything for, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, because what I did next, and what I uncovered, is something no father should ever have to experience. I did not sit there and cry. I did not scream. The initial shock was rapidly transforming into a cold, heavy dread that settled deep in the pit of my stomach. I grabbed my coat and practically ran out of the clinic. The receptionist called out to me asking about my next follow-up appointment, but I pushed through the heavy glass doors into the parking lot without looking back. When I got into my car, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. My chest felt dangerously tight. Just 10 minutes ago, the doctor had praised my remarkable recovery, but now the phantom weakness of that stroke 6 months ago seemed to crawl back into my limbs. That stroke was the exact reason I was trapped in this nightmare. Back in the bitter cold of winter, when I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak clearly, terrified of what the future held, I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I had trusted my daughter. I had signed papers to let her handle my medical bills and manage my affairs while I rehabilitated. I had handed her the keys to my kingdom, because I honestly thought she loved me. She had weaponized my illness. She had waited patiently for the exact moment I was out of the woods, the exact day before her lavish wedding, to pull the trigger and leave me with nothing. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the asphalt as I pulled out onto the main road, heading straight for the main branch of my bank in downtown Boston. The drive was an absolute blur of panic and rage. My mind was racing through 1,000 different scenarios, trying to find a logical explanation, trying to convince myself that this was a misunderstanding or a terrible, cruel joke. But Stephanie did not make jokes like this. And the bank application did not lie. $1.2 million does not just vanish into thin air without a trace. I pulled into the bank parking lot, abandoning my car halfway across two spots, and stormed through the revolving doors. The air conditioning hit my face, but I was sweating profusely. I marched directly up to the front desk, bypassing the line of regular customers waiting for the tellers. I demanded to see the branch manager immediately. I must have looked like a madman, a desperate 70-year-old man with a wild, dangerous look in his eyes, because the teller did not argue or ask me to wait. She pressed a button under her desk, and within moments, a man in a sharp blue suit came out of the glass offices in the back. He ushered me into his private office and closed the door behind us. I slammed my phone down on his desk, pointing a shaking finger at the zero balance on the screen. I told him my life savings had been stolen, that my daughter had somehow drained the account, and that they needed to freeze the wire transfer right this very second. I demanded they call the authorities. I demanded they reverse the transaction before it was too late. The manager did not look panicked. He did not reach for the phone to call the fraud department or the police. Instead, his face fell into an expression of deep, uncomfortable pity. He sighed heavily, adjusting his glasses, and opened a locked file drawer in his desk. He pulled out a thick manila folder with my name printed on the tab. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice maddeningly calm and sympathetic. "No one stole your money. The transfer was authorized and completely legal. We processed it yesterday afternoon at the request of your representative." I slammed my hands down on his desk, leaning over it. "I did not authorize a damn thing," I practically shouted, my voice cracking with emotion. "That is my money. I have been banking here for 30 years. You cannot just let someone take it." The manager slowly shook his head. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder and slid it across the polished mahogany desk toward me. He tapped his index finger against the signature line at the bottom. I looked down. My eyes traced the black ink on the page. It was a document, a legally binding, notarized document. And as I read the bold heading at the very top of the page, the blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. Durable power of attorney. Those 4 words sat heavily at the top of the crisp white page. Below them, printed in standard legal font, was my name, Richard Brooks, and right beside it, designated as my sole attorney, in fact, with unlimited financial authority, was the name of my daughter. My eyes dropped to the bottom right corner of the document. There was my signature. It was shaky, jagged, and barely legible, completely different from my usual firm handwriting. But it was mine. The memory of signing that piece of paper came rushing back, hitting me with the force of a physical blow. It was a bleak Tuesday in late February. I was lying in a hospital bed, the left side of my face drooping, my speech heavily slurred from the stroke. I was terrified. I thought my life was over. Stephanie had walked into the room holding a clipboard and wearing an expression of deep, manufactured concern. She sat on the edge of my bed, held my weakened hand, and gently explained that my medical bills were piling up. The insurance was stalling, the physical therapy clinic required massive copays, and my mortgage still needed to be paid. She told me she needed access to my accounts to keep my life from falling apart, while I focused on getting better. I did not even read the fine print. I trusted her implicitly. She was my little girl, the child I had raised alone after my wife passed away. I thought she was stepping up to protect me in my darkest hour. Instead, I had handed her a loaded weapon and pointed it directly at my own chest. I looked up from the document, my vision blurring slightly. "When did this happen?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How did she take everything at once?" The branch manager folded his hands nervously on top of his desk. He looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting his weight in his expensive leather chair. "Yesterday afternoon, Mr. Brooks," he explained quietly. "She came into the branch in person. She presented the original notarized copy of this power of attorney along with her state identification. She requested an immediate wire transfer of your entire retirement balance, $1.2 million. to where I demanded, my voice suddenly finding its strength. Where did she send my life savings? The manager tapped his keyboard, pulling up the transaction history on his monitor. He hesitated for a second before reading the screen. The funds were wired to an offshore escrow account in the Cayman Islands. It was flagged as a corporate acquisition payment for a business venture. Because the power of attorney grants her absolute authority over your assets, the wire department processed it as a standard high net worth transaction. It cleared the Federal Reserve Network this morning. Offshore. Escrow. The words echoed in my ears like a death sentence. As a retired financial investigator, I knew exactly what those words meant. That money was not just moved, it was gone. It was shielded by international banking privacy laws, untouchable by standard domestic recovery procedures. Freeze it, I commanded, standing up from my chair and leaning over the desk. Call the wire room. Call the fraud department. I am standing right here telling you that I did not authorize this transfer. I am revoking her authority right now. Stop the money! Mr. Brooks, please sit down. The manager pleaded, raising his hands defensively. I understand you are upset, but you need to understand our position. From a legal standpoint, this was not an unauthorized transaction. This power of attorney is legally binding. When she signed that wire authorization, she was acting as you. We cannot simply reverse an international wire transfer that was executed with valid legal documentation. Our hands are completely tied. You need to speak with a lawyer. You need to file a civil suit against your daughter. A civil suit. The concept was almost laughable. A civil lawsuit would take years to wind its way through the backlogged court system. By the time a judge even looked at the file, Stephanie would have moved that money through a dozen different shell companies across the globe. She knew this. She had planned this with absolute, terrifying precision. She waited until the very last business day before her wedding, knowing the banks would be closed for the weekend, giving her a massive head start. I sank back into my chair, the fight temporarily draining out of me. My chest heaved as I struggled to pull oxygen into my lungs. 40 years of early mornings, late nights, missed vacations, and relentless stress. All of it erased with a single stroke of a pen. I was ruined. But then, like a lightning strike, the second half of her phone call flashed through my mind. I took all the money from your account, she had said, and I sold the house. My house, the 4-bedroom colonial in the Boston suburbs. It was fully paid off. It was the only tangible asset I had left in the world. Surely she could not have sold a house overnight. Real estate transactions take weeks of inspections, appraisals, and title searches. She had to be lying just to twist the knife. She wanted to hurt me, to make me feel completely powerless. I did not say another word to the bank manager. I grabbed the copy of the power of attorney from his desk, crumpled it into my fist, and walked out of the office. I ignored his weak apologies calling out behind me. I pushed through the front doors and sprinted across the parking lot to my car. I shoved the key into the ignition. I threw the car into drive and sped out onto the street. The engine roared as I pushed the limit, weaving through midday traffic. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned completely white. Please, I prayed silently. Let her be lying. I took the familiar turns through my quiet neighborhood. The old oak trees cast long shadows across the pavement. The manicured lawns usually brought me a profound sense of peace. This was the sanctuary I had built over 30 years. I pulled into my driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But a wave of temporary relief washed over me when I saw the house. It was still there. The pristine white siding, the dark green shutters, and the large bay window. There were no moving trucks or visible signs of a disturbance. Everything looked exactly the way I had left it that morning. I turned off the engine and took a deep, shuddering breath. I told myself I was overreacting. Selling a house overnight was impossible. Stephanie was just trying to scare me. I grabbed my briefcase and walked up the paved brick path. The afternoon sun was warm against my shoulders, contrasting the freezing terror inside my chest. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my keyring, and selected the heavy brass key. I slid it into the lock. It stopped halfway. I frowned, pulling it out and trying again. It refused to turn. The key simply would not engage the mechanism. I leaned in closer, squinting at the metal fixture. The brass was shiny, completely free of the tiny scratches that come with decades of use. The deadbolt was brand new. Panic, cold and sharp, seized my lungs. I jiggled the handle, pushing my shoulder against the heavy oak door. It was locked tight. I stepped back, my eyes scanning the front porch. That was when the door abruptly swung open from the inside. A man I had never seen before stepped out onto my porch. He was in his late 30s, wearing a sharply tailored gray suit. He held a leather portfolio clipboard and a shiny new smartphone. He looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and weary condescension. It was the look a wealthy landlord gives a troublesome tenant. "Can I help you, buddy?" the man asked, his voice dripping with smooth arrogance. "Help me," I repeated, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and anger. "I live here. This is my house. Who in the world are you, and what are you doing inside my home?" The man let out a short, humorless laugh. He tapped his pen against his clipboard, looking me up and down. "Look, I do not want any trouble," he said smoothly. "But you do not live here anymore. You need to step off the property right now." I stared at him, completely bewildered. "I have owned this property for 30 years, I said, my voice rising. "My clothes are in that closet. My furniture is in that living room. You are trespassing. Get out of my way before I call the police." I took a step forward, intending to push past him into my hallway. The man held up his hand, blocking my path, his face hardening. "I would not do that if I were you, old man," he warned. His tone dropped its polite facade. "I already called the police when I saw your car pull up. I am the property manager for the new owners. This house was purchased yesterday afternoon in a finalized cash sale. The deed has been legally transferred and recorded with the county clerk." A cash sale. I whispered the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. "That is impossible." The man flipped open his clipboard, pulling out a freshly printed legal document. He held it up, keeping it just out of my reach. "The seller used a legally binding power of attorney to execute the transfer," he explained. He sounded like he was reading from a script. "The property was bought free and clear by a corporate entity. Apex Holdings, LLC. They are my clients. They want this property cleared and prepared for a total renovation by Monday. So I am going to ask you nicely one last time. Walk away. Apex Holdings, LLC. The name meant nothing to me, yet it carried the weight of an anvil. The sheer speed of the transaction was terrifying. Stephanie had not just sold the house. She had liquidated it to a corporate buyer who specialized in rapid cash purchases. She had used my stroke, my temporary weakness, to legally steal my home. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly feeling like they were made of lead. I moved away from the door, descending the porch steps. I stopped at the edge of the lawn and looked back at the house. My eyes drifted to the far corner of the wide wrap-around porch. Hanging there by two thick chains was the wooden porch swing I built. I remembered the summer I constructed it. My late wife Diane had sat on those steps. She drank iced tea and laughed as I struggled with the heavy oak planks. We spent countless summer evenings on that swing. We watched the neighborhood kids ride their bikes and talked about our future. This house was not just a financial asset. It was a beautiful monument to my marriage. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of grueling corporate work. I endured decades of high-stress audits and sleepless nights to pay the mortgage. I sacrificed my youth to ensure my family would always have a safe haven. Now, at 70 years old, I was standing on my own front lawn, staring at a stranger locking me out of my life. I was officially homeless. The distant wail of a police siren broke through my crushing shock. A patrol cruiser slowly drove around the corner called by the smug investor. If I stayed, they would surely arrest me for trespassing. I turned my back on everything I owned, got into my car, and retreated to a gas station payphone to make one last call to my cruel daughter. I drove 3 miles until the neon sign of a dilapidated gas station caught my eye. I pulled into the lot, parking near the rusted air pump. My cell phone service was abruptly cut off an hour ago, another calculated move to isolate me completely. I walked over to the sticky payphone bolted to the brick building. I fumbled in my pockets, finding a few stray coins. I had exactly 3 quarters to my name. I fed them into the metal slot, listening to the hollow clink. My hands shook so violently I misdialed and had to press the lever to get my coins back. I took a deep breath, steadied my finger, and dialed the number I had known by heart for 30 years. The phone rang twice. The line clicked open. "Hello," her voice chirped through the receiver. It bubbled with an artificial, sickly, sweet cheerfulness that made my stomach churn. She sounded like a woman happily finalizing floral arrangements, not a daughter who just rendered her father destitute. "Stephanie," I said. My voice was stripped of its warmth. "I am standing outside a gas station because my phone is dead. A man at the house told me you sold it to a corporate buyer. The bank said you wired every penny of my savings to an offshore account. I need you to tell me what is going on right now." I expected her to hang up, scream, or show a fleeting ounce of guilt. Instead, she let out a condescending sigh, like a weary mother dealing with a foolish toddler. "Oh, Dad," she murmured, her tone dripping with practiced pity. "I hoped you would not find out like this. It breaks my heart hearing you so confused. You should be resting at the motel I booked for you. Did you check your email? I sent the reservation." Confused. I repeated the word, tasting like bile. "You stole $1.2 million and my home. There is nothing confusing about grand larceny, Stephanie." She shushed me gently, as if calming a frantic animal. "Dad, please do not use words like that. It is just your condition talking. The doctor warned Derek and me about this. He said your dementia was worsening rapidly after the stroke. We noticed you forgetting things, leaving the stove on, misplacing keys. You are not capable of managing your own affairs anymore. We had to step in before you accidentally ruined yourself." I stood frozen under the flickering light of the gas station awning. Dementia. The doctor gave me a perfectly clean bill of health just 3 hours ago. My mind was as sharp as a diamond. I remembered the exact date of her first steps, my portfolio balance down to the cent, and the precise legal language of the power of attorney she exploited. She fabricated a medical diagnosis to justify her theft. "Derek and I are securing your assets," she continued, her voice shifting into a smooth, rehearsed pitch. "It is for your own good. We are putting the house money into a trust to find you a comfortable state-run nursing home. A place where you have round-the-clock care. You will be safe there. And the cash from your retirement account is not gone. It is a loan. Derek is using it as seed capital for his blockchain startup and to cover final vendor payments for the wedding tomorrow. You always said you wanted to help us build our future. You do not need that money sitting around. You are 70. What were you going to do with it?" Her words hung in the humid air. A state-run nursing home, a loan for a blockchain startup, my life's works, my security, my independence reduced to funding a lavish party and a risky gamble for a man I despised. She rationalized her betrayal so perfectly, she actually believed her own lie. She believed she was the responsible daughter making tough choices for her poor, deteriorating father. "Are you still there, Dad?" she asked, her voice tight with forced patience. "Look, I have to go. The caterer is waiting for my approval on the champagne tower. Go to the motel. We can talk about nursing home brochures after the honeymoon. I love you." She waited for me to explode. She waited for the desperate, confused screaming of an old man losing his grip on reality. If I screamed, it would only validate her narrative. It would prove to Derek and anyone listening that I was indeed unhinged and emotionally unstable. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not utter a single word in response. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch across the phone line. The fear and panic gripping my chest all afternoon suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. "Dad," she prompted again, a tiny flicker of uncertainty finally creeping into her voice. I gently took the heavy receiver and placed it back onto the metal hook. The loud click severed the connection. I leaned against the brick wall, closing my eyes. She thought I was weak. She thought the stroke had reduced my brain to mush. She thought I was a tired old man who would meekly accept his fate and quietly wither away in some sterile government-funded ward. But in her arrogant, greedy rush to strip me of everything I owned, she made a fatal miscalculation. She entirely forgot who I was. She forgot what I did for a living every single day for 4 decades. She remembered me as the father who carved the turkey and paid for her braces. She completely forgot the man who spent 40 years as a forensic auditor, hunting down ruthless corporate embezzlers, tearing apart shell companies, and sending sophisticated financial criminals to federal prison. I opened my eyes. The grief was completely gone. I was no longer a heartbroken father. I was an investigator, and my daughter just became my primary target. I left the gas station driving aimlessly until the glowing neon sign of a roadside motel flickered into view. It was a fading relic on the edge of the city limits with peeling paint and an empty swimming pool full of cracked concrete. I parked under a buzzing street lamp and walked into the cramped lobby. The air smelled of stale smoke and pine disinfectant. The clerk behind the plexiglass window barely looked up as I asked for a room. The rate was $40. I reached into my wallet and pulled out the only cash I had left, a single crisp $100 bill I kept hidden for emergencies. The clerk slid my change and a brass key under the slot. Room 12. I walked down the dimly lit exterior corridor, my footsteps echoing. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was exactly what $40 bought. A sagging double bed covered in a thin bedspread, a flickering television, and a small laminate desk against the far wall. I locked the deadbolt, threw my briefcase onto the mattress, and sat down heavily. The reality of my situation washed over me again, cold and unforgiving. Yesterday, I had a substantial retirement fund and a beautiful home in the suburbs. Now I sat in a dingy motel room with $60 in my pocket. I felt a hot prickling behind my eyes. Tears came not as a gentle stream, but as a violent wave of pure grief. I wept for the daughter I once knew. I wept for the memories we shared, for the little girl who used to hold my hand as we walked to the park, and for the young woman whose college tuition I had proudly paid in full. I let the sorrow consume me for exactly 5 minutes. I sat in the dim light of that cheap room and allowed myself to feel the agonizing pain of a father who had been discarded by his own flesh and blood. And then I stopped. I reached up and wiped the tears from my face with the back of my trembling hand. The grieving father died right there on that sagging mattress. In his place, the professional emerged. I unlatched my leather briefcase and pulled out my beat-up silver laptop. I had carried this machine with me for the last 5 years of my career, and it contained every tool I needed to dismantle a financial empire. Stephanie had assumed my life consisted only of mowing the lawn and balancing a simple checkbook. She had completely dismissed the reality of my 40-year profession. I was not just an accountant. I was a forensic auditor. For 4 decades, my entire existence revolved around hunting down white-collar criminals, exposing corporate frauds, and destroying the carefully constructed lies of arrogant embezzlers. I tracked missing millions through complex webs of offshore accounts and dummy corporations. I sat across the table from powerful executives and watched them sweat as I laid out the paper trails that would ultimately send them to federal prison. I understood the architecture of theft better than the thieves themselves. Stephanie thought she had executed the perfect crime by exploiting a medical crisis and a legal loophole. She did not realize she had just picked a fight with a man who wrote the playbook on financial investigation. I placed the laptop on the small laminate desk and plugged the frayed power cord into a loose wall outlet. I opened the screen and waited for the familiar operating system to boot up. The motel offered free wireless internet, the kind of unsecure, painfully slow connection that would frustrate the average person. But patience was the foundation of my profession. I connected to the network and opened a secure browsing window. My hands, which had been shaking uncontrollably just an hour ago, were now completely steady. The adrenaline of panic had been replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a hunt. I navigated directly to the official website of the Massachusetts Secretary of State. This was the central repository for every registered business entity operating within the state borders. Every corporation, every partnership, and every limited liability company was required by law to file their organizational documents here. These documents were a matter of public record if you knew exactly where to look and how to interpret the data. I bypassed the basic search functions and accessed the corporate database portal. The screen glowed with harsh white light illuminating the peeling wallpaper of my motel room. My eyes scanned the search parameters, adjusting the filters to target newly formed entities and recent changes in corporate governance. When dealing with sudden real estate acquisitions and rapid cash sales, the purchasing company was almost always a shell, a fresh entity created specifically to hold the stolen asset and shield the true beneficiary from immediate liability. I clicked into the primary search bar. I took a slow, deep breath, visualizing the smug real estate investor who ordered me off my property. I recalled the name printed on his official clipboard. I typed the letters methodically, the clacking of the keyboard sounding unnaturally loud. Apex Holdings, LLC. I double-checked the spelling, ensuring absolute accuracy, and then I firmly pressed the Enter key. The small loading icon began to spin in the center of the screen. For a few agonizing seconds, the database queried millions of records. Then the page refreshed. A single matching record appeared in the results list. I clicked on the highlighted blue text to open the master summary page. The document expanded, revealing the dates of incorporation, the principal office address, and the names of the managing members. My eyes immediately dropped to the section labeled Registered Agent. This was the individual legally responsible for receiving correspondence and acting on behalf of the company. As I read the full legal name printed in bold black letters on the glowing screen, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. The name staring back at me was Derek Mitchell, my future son-in-law, the man who was scheduled to stand at the altar with my daughter in less than 24 hours. I stared at the glowing pixels, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. Derek was a man who commanded every room he entered, not through respect, but through sheer, obnoxious volume. At every family Thanksgiving, every Sunday dinner, he would hold court at the head of my table, swirling a glass of my expensive scotch, while bragging endlessly about his massive cryptocurrency portfolio. He wore tailored Italian suits, drove a leased sports car, and constantly talked about early retirement and blockchain investments. I never liked him. My investigator instincts had always screamed that his wealth was an illusion, a fragile house of cards built on borrowed money and arrogant lies. But Stephanie was utterly captivated by his flashy lifestyle. She defended him fiercely whenever I gently questioned his actual income. Now the supposedly wealthy crypto-millionaire was hiding behind a newly minted shell company to steal a 70-year-old man's suburban home. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes rapidly scanning the rest of the corporate filing. Apex Holdings, LLC was not some established real estate firm. The date of incorporation was listed as February 28th. That was exactly 4 days after my stroke, 4 days after I was admitted to the intensive care unit. While I was lying in a hospital bed struggling to remember my own name and signing a power of attorney to give my daughter control of my medical bills. Derek was already filing the paperwork to create the very instrument they would use to rob me. The principal office address listed for the company was not a high-rise downtown. It was a mail drop at a strip mall shipping center across town. They had planned this for months. They had waited patiently in the shadows, watching my physical therapy progress, waiting for the perfect window of opportunity. But I needed to see exactly how they executed the theft of the physical property. I opened a new browser tab and accessed the county clerk's public records portal. This database contained every deed, lien, and mortgage filed in the jurisdiction. I typed in my home address. The search results instantly populated, showing the unbroken chain of title spanning 3 decades. My name and my late wife's name sat proudly at the top of the history for 30 years. But right above our names, stamped with yesterday's date, was a brand new warranty deed. I clicked on the document image to open the scanned file. My stomach plummeted as I read the transaction details. The house was not sold to a stranger in a legitimate market transaction. Stephanie had used the power of attorney to act as the seller. She legally transferred the deed of my fully paid-off home directly to Apex Holdings, LLC, and the purchase price listed on the public deed was a mere $10. For $10, she legally signed away my sanctuary. The smug real estate investor who had locked me out earlier was likely just a cheap property manager or a private contractor hired by Derek to flip the house as quickly as possible. He was just a pawn in their massive game of financial chess. I pushed away from the small laminate desk, pacing the narrow space between the sagging motel bed and the stained window curtains. I ran my hands over my face, my mind racing to put the fractured pieces together. The timeline made perfect sense. The legal mechanism they chose made perfect sense. The power of attorney gave her the absolute right to sign that deed, making the transfer completely legitimate in the eyes of the local government. She had the authority to sell my property to anyone she wanted for any price she deemed appropriate. By selling it to her fiancé's shell company for $10, she technically stayed within the boundaries of the law while effectively stealing the entire asset. It was a ruthless, brilliant maneuver. But the underlying logic of the crime was deeply flawed. Something fundamental was missing from this picture. If Derek was truly a successful investor with a massive cryptocurrency portfolio, he would not need to steal an old man's modest suburban house. And even if he was a total fraud, a desperate man drowning in hidden debt, why go through the trouble of stealing the physical property at all? Stephanie had already successfully wired $1.2 million in pure, untraceable cash to an offshore escrow account. They already possessed a literal fortune in highly liquid assets. Stealing the physical house was an incredibly risky and unnecessary complication. Real estate is highly regulated, inherently slow to liquidate on the open market, and leaves a massive permanent paper trail. It absolutely did not fit the profile of a clean, fast getaway. Why take the house when they already had the cash? I stopped pacing in the middle of the room. A cold realization washed over me, chilling my bones. You do not steal a physical building if you are planning to flee the country tomorrow morning on your honeymoon. You do not deal with property managers and locks if your goal is to simply disappear with $1 million. You only steal a house if you desperately need to extract the physical equity trapped inside its walls. They needed more money, and they needed it instantly. The $1.2 million was not enough to cover whatever problem Derek was currently facing. I rushed back to the laptop and sat down in the creaking chair. I had only looked at the deed transfer. I had not looked at the secondary encumbrances. I navigated back to the clerk's database and clicked on the tab labeled Mortgage and Lien Registry. I needed to see what Derek did with the property the second he took ownership. The loading bar on the county clerk's website crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness. I watched the spinning blue wheel with the intense, unblinking focus of a seasoned hunter finally zeroing in on the scent of his prey. When the Mortgage and Lien Registry page finally populated on my dim laptop screen, the undeniable truth stared back at me in stark, unforgiving black and white text. They're officially filed merely 3 hours after the fraudulent warranty deed was recorded, was a massive commercial deed of trust. The designated borrower was of course listed as Apex Holdings, LLC. I clicked on the blue hyperlink to fully expand the intricate details of the legal financial instrument. My eyes rapidly scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. This was absolutely not a standard 30-year fixed-rate mortgage from any reputable national banking institution. Any junior auditor knows that traditional banks require weeks of meticulous underwriting, exhaustive income verification, and rigorous on-site property appraisals. Legitimate financial institutions do not simply hand over massive sums of liquid cash to a newly formed faceless shell company, possessing zero operating history and zero verifiable revenue streams. This transaction was something entirely different. The lender explicitly listed on the official public document was a shadowy private equity syndicate I had never encountered before, supposedly operating out of a virtually untraceable post office box located in Wilmington, Delaware. It was a classic hard money lender. In the murky high-stakes world of forensic financial accounting, hard money loans represent the ultimate screaming red flag. They are notoriously short-term, astronomically high-interest, strictly asset-based loans. They are almost exclusively sought by desperate individuals who cannot secure traditional regulated financing because their personal credit is completely ruined, or because they need physical cash with an extreme terrifying level of speed. I carefully read the specific terms of the loan permanently embedded in the public county filing. The exact principal amount distributed was $800,000. The mandated interest rate was a staggering predatory 15%, with a punishing balloon payment due in exactly 6 months. Derek had cynically used the physical structure of my beloved home, the precious equity I had painstakingly built over 3 grueling decades of disciplined monthly mortgage payments, as leverage to instantly secure a massive pile of untraceable cash. The final puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind, forming a picture of pure, unadulterated greed. Stephanie did not sell my house to preserve my assets. She maliciously transferred the title to Derek's newly minted company solely so he could immediately mortgage the property to the absolute hilt. They mercilessly stripped every single ounce of financial equity out of the property in one swift, ruthlessly calculated stroke. That arrogant real estate investor standing on my front porch earlier today was not a legitimate homebuyer. He was an aggressive asset manager, working directly for the shadow lender, dispatched to quickly secure the physical collateral and prepare the house for a rapid cutthroat liquidation sale to recoup their incredibly high-risk loan. I leaned back heavily in the creaking wooden motel chair, slowly rubbing my aching temples as the sheer devastating scale of the theft fully washed over my exhausted mind. Between the sudden massive wire transfer draining my entire retirement account and the predatory hard money loan taken against my family property, my own daughter had successfully stolen a grand total of $2 million. $2 million in pure liquid cash acquired in less than 48 hours of frantic activity. It was a truly breathtaking amount of money to steal from a single elderly family member. But more importantly, to my investigative mind, their chosen methodology revealed a crucial, fatal weakness in their master plan. The execution of these transactions was entirely too fast, incredibly sloppy, and undeniably painfully desperate. A genuine cryptocurrency millionaire with a booming, highly diversified investment portfolio absolutely does not need to borrow $800,000 at a predatory 15% interest rate. A genuinely wealthy, successful investor certainly does not use his future father-in-law's modest suburban family home to desperately secure a short-term bridge loan. You only willingly agree to those brutal financial suicide terms when you have absolutely no other viable choice left in the world. You only take a hard money loan when the wolves are already gathered at your front door, aggressively scratching at the wooden frame ready to tear you and your entire life apart. Derek Mitchell was clearly not a brilliant financial genius building a revolutionary technology startup. He was a drowning, utterly panicking man desperately gasping for air. And he had somehow convinced my incredibly naive, blindingly greedy daughter to happily throw my entire life's work to him as a temporary life preserver. Whatever deep trouble Derek was currently swimming in, it was dark, complex, and incredibly dangerous for everyone involved. He desperately needed $2 million in clean cash by this coming weekend, and he was completely willing to permanently destroy a 70-year-old man to get his hands on it. Sitting alone in a cheap, depressing motel room with a dusty laptop was simply no longer enough to win this war. I had successfully uncovered the mechanical method of the massive fraud, but I urgently needed to discover the true underlying motive. I needed to find out exactly who was aggressively hunting Derek Mitchell in the shadows, because that unknown entity was the absolute key to tearing his entire fraudulent world apart. I needed serious boots on the ground immediately. I needed someone with deep, trusted connections to the shadowy underbelly of the financial world, someone who could quietly dig up the ugly dirt that was never filed in public county records. I reached deep into my coat pocket and pulled out my old cell phone. I navigated my contacts and dialed a private number I had not called since my quiet retirement party, exactly 5 long years ago. The encrypted line rang 3 slow times before a gruff, deeply familiar voice finally answered the call. "Victor." I said, my voice perfectly steady and freezing cold. "I need your immediate help right now with something big." 30 minutes later, I sat alone in the dark corner booth of an all-night diner on the city outskirts. I stared out the rain-streaked window into the empty parking lot, nursing a cup of bitter black coffee. A pair of headlights suddenly cut through the darkness. A sleek black town car pulled into a space near the front doors. Victor pushed through the diner entrance, the brass bell above the heavy door chiming loudly. Victor was my oldest friend, and more importantly, the most ruthless criminal defense attorney in the entire state. He was a man who made his living navigating the darkest, most treacherous waters of the legal system. He offered no empty words of sympathy or any warm greetings. He simply placed a thick manila folder onto the table and signaled the waitress for a coffee. "I gave you the names and corporate entities," I said softly. "Tell me what you found." Victor opened the folder, his face a mask of grim professionalism. "You were right to call me Richard," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "Because the situation is far worse than a simple family dispute over a piece of real estate. I ran Derek Mitchell through every proprietary database my firm possesses. Your future son-in-law is not a cryptocurrency millionaire. He is a complete and utter fraud. He does not own a single digital asset. He owns absolutely nothing but a terrifying mountain of hidden debt." I stared at the documents, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "But he does not owe it to a bank, Richard. He owes exactly $2 million to a highly organized, extremely violent, illegal gambling syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. Derek is a degenerate sports bettor who got entirely in over his head. He spent the last 3 years borrowing heavily from the wrong people to fund a lifestyle he could never actually afford, using his flashy persona to attract more loans to cover the old ones. A classic Ponzi scheme, but built entirely on his own terrifying gambling addiction. 3 weeks ago, the syndicate finally ran out of patience. They gave him a hard deadline. He either produces $2 million in clean, untraceable cash by the end of this week, or they are going to make a very permanent, very violent example out of him. That is why they needed your money so desperately, Richard. That is why they took the house and stripped the equity with a predatory hard money loan. They were piecing together his ransom." "But why the wedding?" I asked, tracing the rim of my coffee cup. "Why go through with a massive $300,000 ceremony tomorrow if he is running for his life? Why not just take my money and disappear into the night?" Victor let out a dry, cynical laugh. "Because you cannot simply hand $2 million in stolen funds to a criminal syndicate without triggering a massive federal investigation. You have to clean it first. The wedding is not a celebration, Richard. It is a highly orchestrated money laundering operation. Half of these high-end caterers, floral designers, and transport services are known shell companies tied to the Vegas syndicate. Stephanie is using the stolen funds to overpay these fake vendors for services that will never actually be rendered. The rest of the money, the bulk of your retirement savings, is being funneled into an offshore honeymoon account in Dubai. Once they land, that account will be instantly drained by the syndicate's international proxies. By Monday morning, your money will be completely washed. Derek's life debt will be paid in full, and your daughter will be married to a man who literally sold your life to save his own skin. The sheer cruelty of it all was almost too much to comprehend. My daughter knew. She had to know. She had actively chosen to participate in a massive criminal enterprise, sacrificing my financial security and my home just to protect a degenerate gambler. Victor closed the folder and leaned back against the vinyl seat. "We have enough evidence right here to stop this," he said firmly. "I can call the local police chief right now. I know him personally. I can have a dozen squad cars at that bridal suite before the sun even comes up. We can have them arrested for elder financial abuse." "No," I commanded softly. "No local police." Victor looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "Richard, they stole $2 million. If they get on that plane tomorrow, you will never see a single dime of it again. I know exactly how the local system works, Victor." I explained, my voice chillingly calm. "If we call the local cops, it becomes a messy civil dispute over a valid power of attorney. The local prosecutors will drag their feet. It will take years of agonizing court battles just to prove she acted in bad faith. Meanwhile, the money will successfully flow through the offshore channels and vanish forever into the syndicate's pockets. The house will be foreclosed upon by the hard money lender. I will spend the rest of my miserable life fighting my own daughter in civil court, while Derek walks away completely clean. I refuse to let that happen." "Then what exactly is your plan, Richard? What do you want to do?" I looked down at my hands. They were no longer the trembling hands of a terrified old man. They were the steady, calculated hands of a hunter preparing a lethal trap. "I am not going to stop them from laundering the money," I said, looking back up into Victor's eyes. "I am going to let them put on their beautiful wedding clothes. I am going to let them walk down the aisle. We cannot arrest them for a simple family dispute. We need to catch them actively committing a federal crime in front of 300 witnesses." Victor did not argue with my decision. Instead, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to a private investigator he kept heavily on retainer, and the second was to a contact at the federal level, laying the very quiet, very preliminary groundwork for what was about to come. He knew exactly how the system worked, and he knew that taking down an organized money laundering operation required patience and absolute precision. We could not afford a single mistake. By 8 o'clock that evening, we were parked illegally in the loading zone of an exclusive 5-star restaurant in the heart of the downtown financial district. We sat in the heavy silence of Victor's sleek black SUV enveloped by the dark tint of the reinforced windows. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, casting a cold, cinematic glow over the bustling street. I kept my eyes fixed on the grand brass-plated entrance of the restaurant. According to the digital footprints Victor's investigator had quickly traced, Derek had made a highly publicized, incredibly expensive dinner reservation here weeks ago to celebrate the eve of their wedding. We were waiting for the guests of honor to arrive. Victor reached into the center console and retrieved a small, unassuming black device. It looked exactly like a standard piece of black chewing gum, but it was actually a highly sophisticated military-grade audio transmitter. He handed it to me along with a tiny wireless earpiece. He explained the mechanics of the device in a low professional whisper, detailing its impressive range and crystal-clear microphone sensitivity. I rolled the small piece of technology between my thumb and index finger, feeling the dense weight of what I was about to do. Just as I secured the earpiece into my right ear, a sleek silver luxury sedan pulled smoothly up to the valet stand. My breath caught in my throat. The passenger door opened and Stephanie stepped out onto the damp pavement. She looked absolutely radiant, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, but it was not her smile that seized my attention. It was what she was wearing. Draped casually over her shoulders was a pristine white cashmere designer coat. I recognized the brand instantly. It was a piece that easily retailed for over $5,000. Derek emerged from the driver's side, adjusting the cuffs of a custom-tailored suit, carrying 4 large shopping bags bearing the logos of the most expensive boutiques in the city. They were laughing. They were genuinely deeply happy. They handed the keys to the valet and linked arms, looking like the absolute picture of a young, successful couple without a single care in the entire world. Seeing them like that, dripping in luxury purchased entirely with the blood and sweat of my 4 decades of labor, triggered a profound and permanent shift inside my chest. Whatever lingering shred of paternal mercy I had been foolishly clinging to, whatever tiny, desperate hope remained that my daughter was simply confused or somehow manipulated against her will, instantly vaporized into thin air. I was sleeping on a sagging mattress in a $40 motel room, eating vending machine crackers for dinner, while she paraded around in $5,000 worth of stolen cashmere. She was not a victim. She was an active, enthusiastic participant in my utter financial destruction. The father she had known was officially dead, buried beneath the mountain of their arrogant greed. I opened the heavy door of the SUV and stepped out into the chilly night air. Victor gave me a single confirming nod. I pulled the collar of my worn jacket up against the wind and walked briskly toward the restaurant entrance, keeping my head down to avoid the bright security lights. I slipped inside the busy foyer just seconds after Stephanie and Derek were escorted into the main dining room. The restaurant was crowded, loud, and filled with the clinking of expensive crystal glasses. It was the perfect environment for a distraction. I spotted them being seated at a premium corner booth, secluded enough for a private conversation, but entirely accessible from the main aisle. I walked past the host stand, pretending to look for the restroom. A young waiter carrying a heavy silver tray laden with ice water and bread plates was moving quickly toward their section. I adjusted my trajectory, matching his brisk pace. As he passed the edge of their booth, I intentionally stepped directly into his path, turning my shoulder at the very last second to ensure a solid but seemingly accidental collision. The waiter stumbled forward, the heavy silver tray tilting dangerously. A glass of ice water tipped over, spilling directly onto the polished wooden table, splashing inches away from Derek's designer suit. The waiter gasped instantly, launching into a flurry of frantic apologies, grabbing cloth napkins to desperately sop up the spreading puddle. Stephanie let out an annoyed sigh, aggressively pulling her expensive coat away from the water. In the ensuing chaos, while all eyes were locked on the spilled water and the panicking young waiter, I leaned over the edge of the table, muttering my own quiet apologies for causing the clumsy accident. With a swift, practiced motion of my right hand, I pressed the tiny black transmitter firmly under the thick wooden lip of their dining table. It stuck instantly. I gave a polite nod, turned on my heel, and walked straight out of the restaurant without ever looking back. I crossed the street, climbed back into the dark sanctuary of Victor's tinted SUV, and shut the door. I pressed the small activation button on my earpiece, the device immediately syncing with the hidden transmitter. A soft burst of static hissed in my ear, followed instantly by the crystal-clear sound of ice clinking in a glass and the unmistakable, arrogant voice of my future son-in-law. I closed my eyes and listened. The trap was successfully set, and the hunt had officially begun. The tiny earpiece delivered the ambient noise of the restaurant with terrifying clarity. I could hear the soft clinking of silverware against fine china, the murmurs of surrounding conversations, and the gentle pouring of expensive wine. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the leather headrest of Victor's vehicle, completely tuning out the busy world outside the dark tinted windows. My entire existence was reduced solely to the live audio feed streaming directly into my own right ear, hanging on every single spoken word. For the first few minutes, the conversation was maddeningly mundane. Stephanie was admiring the quality of her brand new coat, and Derek was boasting about the exorbitant price of the vintage wine he had just ordered for the table. But beneath his manufactured confidence, I could easily hear a distinct nervous tremor in Derek's voice. He was talking too fast. He was drinking too quickly. The heavy burden of his $2 million debt to the violent Las Vegas syndicate was clearly suffocating him even as he sat in the lap of stolen luxury. Then the topic inevitably shifted. I heard the solid clunk of a heavy glass being set down on the wooden table, followed by Derek's hushed, urgent tone. "What if the old man goes to the cops?" Derek asked, his voice strained and tight with genuine panic. "He showed up at the house today, Stephanie. He knows about the cash sale. What if he finds a lawyer who will actually listen to him? What if they manage to freeze the offshore transfer before Monday morning?" The silence that followed his panicked questions felt like it lasted for a lifetime. I held my breath in the dark SUV, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting desperately to hear how my daughter would respond. I still harbored a microscopic fragment of hope that she might express a sliver of remorse, a fleeting moment of guilt for rendering me completely homeless and destitute. Instead, a soft, chilling laugh floated through the earpiece. It was a cold, cruel sound that made my blood freeze solid in my veins. "Stop being so paranoid, Derek," Stephanie replied, her voice dripping with absolute dismissive arrogance. "My father is completely harmless. He is just a tired, confused old man who barely survived a stroke. He does not have the money, the energy, or the mental capacity to hire a decent lawyer, let alone fight a legally binding power of attorney in court. He is probably sitting in that cheap motel right now, crying over a cup of instant coffee and trying to figure out how to use his television. You are worrying about absolutely nothing." But he was asking questions. Derek pressed his anxiety, refusing to subside. He was not acting confused. He was angry. If he makes enough noise, he could ruin everything. He could delay the Dubai flight. Stephanie sighed loudly, the sound of a woman severely irritated by a minor inconvenience. "Let the old fool rot in that motel." She snapped, her tone suddenly hardening into pure, unadulterated malice. "I do not care if he is angry. Once his pocket cash runs out, he will become a ward of the state. They will throw him in some miserable county nursing home and drug him until he forgets his own name. We will be safely in Dubai by Tuesday morning. The money will be completely washed by your people, and we will never have to deal with his pathetic complaints ever again. He is just dead weight, Derek. He always has been. We did what we had to do to survive. Now drink your wine and act like a man who is getting married tomorrow. I cannot stand it when you whine." Those words struck me with the devastating force of a physical blow to the chest. He is dead weight. Let the old fool rot. The sheer calculated cruelty of her statement shattered the very foundation of my reality. In that singular, horrifying moment, the absolute truth was laid bare before me. Stephanie was not a naive girl who had been manipulated by a smooth-talking con artist. She was not a victim of Derek's financial desperation. She knew exactly who he was. She knew entirely about his massive gambling debts and his dangerous connections to the violent Las Vegas syndicate. She was a fully aware, completely willing accomplice in this massive criminal conspiracy. When forced to choose between the safety of the father who had loved and protected her for her entire life and the survival of a degenerate criminal boyfriend, she did not even hesitate. She actively, deliberately chose to sacrifice my life. She orchestrated the theft of my life savings and the loss of my family home with cold, sociopathic precision. I sat perfectly still in the passenger seat of the dark SUV. The suffocating grief that had threatened to completely consume my soul earlier in the day was completely gone, eradicated entirely by a surging tide of pure glacial fury. The woman sitting in that expensive restaurant, sipping vintage wine and laughing about my impending demise in a state-run nursing facility, was absolutely not my loving daughter. My daughter was dead. The creature wearing her face was simply a ruthless thief who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating her victim. I reached up slowly, my fingers grasping the tiny wireless earpiece. My hands were no longer shaking like a terrified victim. They were as steady and as cold as carved stone. I pulled the small device out of my ear, severing the sickening audio feed, and placed it quietly into the center console of the vehicle. I took one long, deep breath to center my racing mind. I turned my head to look directly at Victor, who was watching me with silent, grim understanding in the shadows. "We do not call the local police," I said, my voice dangerously calm and echoing with absolute terrifying finality. "We call the feds." The drive to his downtown law firm was entirely silent. The city streets were completely deserted as we made our way back. The agonizing sorrow that had threatened to completely shatter my mind earlier that afternoon had been entirely burned away, replaced by the freezing mechanical precision of my former profession. We rode the private elevator up to the 34th floor of his high-rise building in total silence. Victor unlocked the heavy mahogany doors of his private suite and switched on the low amber desk lamps. The room smelled of expensive leather and old paper. He pointed to a massive polished oak conference table sitting in the center of the room. "This is your war room," he said quietly. I unlatched my battered leather briefcase and began to pull out the thick stacks of printed documents I had gathered at the cheap motel. I laid them out across the smooth wooden surface, arranging them with the meticulous, practiced care of a surgeon preparing a sterile operating theater. I placed the fraudulent warranty deed for my family home on the far left. Next to it, I positioned the predatory hard money loan documents that Derek had secured from the shadow lender. In the center of the table, I arranged the detailed incorporation records for Apex Holdings, LLC, highlighting Derek's name as the primary registered agent. On the right side, I spread out the banking alerts, the wire transfer confirmation numbers, and the international routing codes tracing my stolen retirement funds to the offshore escrow account in the Cayman Islands. Finally, Victor reached into his own leather briefcase and handed me his dossier. It was the thick, damning file detailing Derek's massive $2 million debt to the violent Las Vegas gambling syndicate. I stood over the expansive table, my eyes darting between the pieces of paper. I began to connect the dots, drawing thick black lines with a heavy marker on a large white presentation board that Victor had wheeled into the room. I was no longer a grieving father trying to understand why his only child had betrayed him. I was a senior forensic auditor actively deconstructing a money laundering operation. I analyzed the flow of the illicit capital with unblinking detachment. I tracked the movement of the physical equity stripped from my house, mapping exactly how it was designed to merge with my stolen retirement funds within the heavily shielded offshore accounts. I looked down at the signature of my own daughter printed on the wire transfer authorizations. I did not see the little girl who used to sit on my shoulders and watch the fireworks. I did not see the young woman I had proudly watched walk across the university stage to accept her college diploma. I saw a primary target. I saw the chief architect and willing facilitator of a financial crime. How I was treating my own flesh and blood with the same ruthless, uncompromising intensity I had historically reserved for cartel bosses, corrupt corporate executives, and organized crime syndicates. The severing between father and daughter was complete. I was compiling a comprehensive federal indictment package piece by piece. I spent the next 3 hours drafting a comprehensive forensic financial report. I typed on Victor's secure desktop computer, translating the chaotic web of stolen assets, dummy corporations, and offshore wire transfers into a clear, undeniable narrative of federal wire fraud and international money laundering. I cited the sections of the United States Code that Stephanie and Derek had willfully violated. I documented the timeline of the unauthorized property transfer, the predatory loan origination, and the offshore movement of my retirement capital. I constructed an airtight legal trap designed specifically to withstand the intense scrutiny of a federal judge. The sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming, and the malicious intent behind their actions was undeniable. They had arrogantly assumed that their crimes would remain hidden behind the protective veil of a family dispute. They had severely miscalculated. When I finally finished the exhaustive document, I printed a master copy and placed it gently on top of the organized stacks of evidence on the conference table. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline, casting a pale gray light through the tall office windows. Victor had been sitting quietly in a leather armchair in the corner of the room and watching me work with a mixture of professional respect and deep personal concern. He slowly stood up, walked over to the table, and looked down at the towering stack of paper that represented the complete destruction of my daughter's future. He picked up the final summary report, reading over my precise legal conclusions and recommended federal charges. He placed the paper back onto the polished wood and looked me directly in the eyes. The heavy silence of the early morning stretched between us. "Richard," he said, his gravelly voice filled with a heavy, ominous warning. "Are you absolutely sure you want to proceed with this specific course of action? Once we hand this package over to the federal authorities, there is no going back. We completely lose the ability to negotiate or retract the complaint. If we trigger this federal investigation today, she does not just get a slap on the wrist. She does hard time in a federal penitentiary. There is no early parole in the federal system. She will lose the best years of her life behind bars." I slowly picked up a heavy silver ink pen from the large wooden desk. I looked at the signature line at the bottom of my completed forensic report. My hand was completely steady, devoid of any hesitation or lingering doubt. I pressed the tip of the pen against the crisp white paper and signed my full name with firm, deliberate strokes. I placed the ink pen down and looked right back at my oldest friend. "She made her own bed," I said very quietly. "Now she is finally going to sleep in a federal cell." Victor stared at me for a long time, the silence of the office pressing down around us. He shook his head, rubbing his tired eyes with the back of his hand. He understood the profound gravity of what I was doing, but his brilliant legal mind immediately began looking for the fatal flaw in my strategy. He leaned over the polished oak table and tapped his index finger aggressively against the copy of the power of attorney document I had obtained from the bank manager. "Richard," he began, his voice laced with genuine skepticism, "I understand your anger and I agree she deserves to be punished. But you are ignoring the most massive hurdle in this entire federal case. This piece of paper right here. You signed it. It was properly notarized. From the perspective of the bank and the county clerk, she had the absolute legal authority to drain that account and sell your home. The federal prosecutor will look at this and immediately kick it back to civil court. They will say she simply abused her fiduciary duty, which is a state-level domestic issue. They will not touch it." I listened to his entirely accurate legal assessment without breaking eye contact. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled since I received that devastating banking alert yesterday morning. I reached down to the bottom of my battered leather briefcase and unzipped a hidden interior compartment. I pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of heavy stock paper. I placed it gently onto the center of the conference table, directly over the fraudulent real estate deed. "Read the date stamped at the top right corner," I instructed him quietly. Victor frowned, adjusting his glasses as he picked up the document. His eyes scanned the first few lines of text, and I watched in real time as all the color completely drained from his face. His jaw dropped. 3 months ago, I explained, my voice echoing with absolute authority in the empty room. By late May, my physical therapy had worked absolute miracles. My speech was entirely back to normal, and my cognitive functions were sharper than they had been in a decade. I felt like myself again. I decided it was time to put my financial house back in order. I took a taxi downtown to a licensed public notary. I sat in their office and drafted a comprehensive, legally binding revocation of power of attorney. I signed it, had it officially witnessed, and then I walked directly over to the county courthouse and filed it permanently into the public record. As of that specific Tuesday afternoon in May, my daughter was officially stripped of any and all legal authority over my medical decisions, my real estate assets, and my financial accounts. The original document she possessed became worthless. But you never told her, Victor whispered, his eyes frantically reading the legal language of the revocation. You never sent her a formal notice. I shook my head slowly. No, I did not. Why would I? At that point in time, I still foolishly believed she was my loving daughter. I assumed she only held the original document as a temporary emergency measure while I was recovering in the hospital. I simply viewed the revocation as routine legal housekeeping. I honestly thought that the original power of attorney was sitting forgotten in a dusty drawer somewhere, never to be seen again. I never in a million years imagined she would actively pull it out and attempt to weaponize it against me. Because she never checked the updated county records, she had absolutely no idea her authority had been legally terminated 3 months prior to her little crime spree. Victor slowly placed the document back onto the table, his hands actually trembling with excitement. Do you realize exactly what this means, Richard? He asked, his voice rising in volume. This changes the entire landscape of the prosecution. When she walked into that bank branch yesterday afternoon and confidently presented that document to authorize the wire transfer, she was not an overzealous family member abusing a fiduciary duty. She was knowingly presenting a legally dead instrument to a federally insured institution. That entirely eliminates the family financial abuse defense. This is textbook, undeniable bank fraud. It is the malicious, unauthorized access of a financial institution. She essentially walked into that bank with a loaded gun and robbed it using a forged identity. And when she signed that warranty deed for the house, she committed massive real estate fraud. She is utterly defenseless. Exactly, I confirmed, leaning forward and placing both hands firmly on the edge of the conference table. She thought she was exploiting a gray area of domestic law, but she actually walked completely blindly into a massive federal felony trap. And that is exactly why we bypassed the local police department. By executing that massive wire transfer, she moved stolen funds across state lines and ultimately routed them into international offshore accounts. The hard money loan Derek secured utilized interstate banking networks to clear the funds. Every single action they took elevates this from a local property dispute into a massive multi-jurisdictional federal crime. They committed federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and bank fraud, all in the span of a single afternoon. The penalties are incredibly severe. Victor nodded rapidly, his brilliant mind already formulating the next crucial steps. We have the absolute perfect storm of evidence, he said, grabbing his cell phone from the table. But the timeline is incredibly tight, Richard. If we wait too long, that money completes its cycle through the Dubai accounts and disappears into the Las Vegas syndicate. Once it crosses that final international threshold and gets dispersed, tracking it becomes an absolute nightmare. We need authorities to intercept the flow of capital while the transaction is still pending in the global system. We need the Federal Bureau of Investigation to act immediately. Victor was absolutely right. Time was our greatest enemy. Every passing second allowed them to move closer to their ultimate escape. I spent the next 2 agonizing hours systematically compiling the final physical evidence binder. It was a painstaking process that required total perfection. I was no longer just a grieving retired man desperately trying to salvage his depleted savings. I completely weaponized every single ounce of my 40 years of institutional investigative knowledge. I knew exactly what federal prosecutors needed to physically see to authorize an immediate tactical raid. They absolutely did not want emotional narratives or tearful stories about a broken family dynamic. They demanded cold, hard, mathematically verifiable data. I deliberately created 4 distinct sections within the thick leather binder. Section 1 contained the certified copy of the original power of attorney positioned directly alongside the legally binding county-stamped revocation document. This pairing firmly established the foundational deception of her entire scheme. Section 2 systematically deconstructed the rapid, highly suspicious formation of Apex Holdings, LLC. It explicitly tied Derek Mitchell to the fraudulent corporate entity, that was used to illegally purchase my beloved family home for a mere $10. Section 3 meticulously mapped out the complex offshore wire transfers. It included the exact banking routing numbers, the precise timestamps of the authorizations, and the ultimate destination escrow account securely located in the Cayman Islands. Finally, Section 4 contained Victor's devastating private intelligence file. This crucial section definitively connected the entire financial operation directly to the violent Las Vegas gambling syndicate. I organized the raw data so perfectly that a completely inexperienced first-year law student could follow the money trail blindfolded. Once the physical evidence was structured flawlessly, I aggressively moved on to the complex legal framework. I was essentially handing the federal government a fully investigated trial-ready indictment served directly on a silver platter. They did not have to do any heavy lifting or prolonged undercover work. I typed out a remarkably comprehensive executive summary. It explicitly detailed exactly how my own daughter and her criminal fiancé had deliberately violated strict federal law. I formally cited Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1343, which governs wire fraud. I explained in surgical detail how they had willfully utilized interstate and international telecommunications networks to execute a malicious scheme deliberately designed to defraud me of my physical property and my liquid assets. Because the massive wire transfer crossed international borders, it automatically triggered incredibly severe federal sentencing enhancements. Then I carefully outlined their blatant violation of Title 18, Section 1344, the absolute governing statute for bank fraud. By knowingly presenting a legally defunct and utterly void power of attorney to a federally insured financial institution, Stephanie had deliberately deceived the bank into releasing $1.2 million. This was absolutely not a subjective gray area of local civil litigation. It was a black and white, undeniable federal felony punishable by up to 30 years in federal prison and a mandatory penalty of $1 million. I meticulously highlighted these specific legal statutes in bright yellow ink. I wanted the investigating special agents to instantly see the massive, terrifying scale of the crimes staring them right in the face. They had stolen my money, but they had also brazenly defrauded the United States banking system. The federal government absolutely does not take kindly to its regulated institutions being used to seamlessly launder stolen money for violent organized crime syndicates. By the time the morning sun fully illuminated Victor's downtown office, the massive legal dossier was completely finished. It was a dense, highly detailed 50-page document that effectively contained the absolute destruction of Stephanie and Derek's future. Victor grabbed his heavy wool coat, and we headed straight down to the underground parking garage. We drove slowly through the awakening streets of downtown Boston, the busy morning commute just beginning to steadily build around us. The morning air was crisp and bitterly cold, perfectly mirroring the glacial ice that had permanently settled deep inside my chest. We eventually pulled up to the imposing, heavily fortified concrete exterior of the FBI field office. We passed through the incredibly rigorous security checkpoints, silently surrendering our cell phones and walking through sensitive metal detectors before being officially escorted into a sterile, brightly lit waiting room. After 20 agonizing minutes of total silence, a young, sharply dressed special agent confidently walked through the heavy double doors. He looked to be in his early 30s, possessing the kind of arrogant, unshakable confidence that only truly comes from a freshly minted federal badge and a distinct lack of real-world investigative experience. He introduced himself very briefly and quickly asked us to step into a small, windowless interrogation room down the hall. He sat directly across from us at a cold metal table, casually holding a blank notepad and a cheap plastic pen. He looked at me with a potent mixture of youthful impatience and thinly veiled bureaucratic condescension. "Look, Mr. Brooks," he sighed heavily, leaning back lazily in his chair before I even had a real chance to speak. I briefly reviewed the preliminary intake notes from the front desk out there. I completely understand that you are very upset about your daughter taking your retirement money. But the FBI simply does not handle messy domestic disputes or family inheritance arguments. You really need to hire a local civil attorney and take this grievance directly to family court. If she possessed a signed power of attorney, there is absolutely nothing the federal government can legally do for you. It is strictly a local civil matter, and you are honestly wasting our valuable time today. I did not say a single word in response to his arrogant dismissal. I simply reached deep into my leather briefcase, pulled out the massive 50-page forensic legal dossier, and slammed it forcefully down onto the metal table with a deafening crack. The deafening thud of the heavy leather binder hitting the metal table echoed sharply in the small interrogation room. The young, arrogant agent jumped slightly in his chair, his condescending smirk instantly vanishing. He opened his mouth to reprimand me for the sudden outburst, but the loud noise had already attracted attention from the hallway. The heavy metal door swung open, and an older, sharply dressed man stepped into the room. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit and carried an unmistakable air of seasoned authority. It was the special agent in charge of the Boston field office. He glanced briefly at the startled young agent, and then turned his sharp, calculating gaze toward Victor and me. For a moment, his expression was perfectly neutral, but then his eyes widened slightly in genuine surprise. He stepped further into the room, a look of profound respect crossing his weathered face. "Richard Brooks," the older agent said, his voice deep and steady. I thought I recognized that relentless stare. It has been over a decade since the Enright corporate embezzlement trial. I was just a junior investigator back then, but I never forgot the way you absolutely dismantled their offshore holding companies on the witness stand. I gave him a brief, curt nod. "It is good to see you again, Agent Miller. I wish the circumstances of this reunion were strictly professional. Unfortunately, this is intensely personal. Your junior agent here was just attempting to inform me that the Federal Bureau of Investigation does not involve itself in domestic family disputes. I brought this binder to respectfully prove him wrong." Agent Miller frowned, shooting a sharp, reprimanding look at his younger subordinate. He pulled out a metal chair and sat down at the table, pulling the massive 50-page forensic dossier toward him. He did not speak. For the next 30 minutes, the only sound in the small interrogation room was the crisp rustling of heavy paper as the seasoned federal agent methodically turned the pages. I watched his eyes track across the meticulously organized data. I saw his initial skepticism melt away rapidly, replaced by intense, razor-sharp focus. He lingered heavily on the certified revocation of the power of attorney, tracing his finger over the official county timestamp. Then he reached the final section of the binder. He read Victor's extensive intelligence file detailing Derek Mitchell's $2 million debt to the violent Las Vegas gambling syndicate. When Agent Miller finally looked up from the documents, his entire demeanor had completely transformed. The polite nostalgia was gone, replaced by the predatory intensity of a federal hunter who had just been handed the keys to a massive kingdom. "This is not a family dispute," Agent Miller said quietly, his eyes locked onto mine. "This is a meticulously orchestrated federal money laundering operation. We have been actively trying to penetrate this specific Vegas syndicate for the last 3 years. They are notoriously careful, keeping their domestic banking completely isolated from their illegal gambling revenues. But this idiot, this Derek Mitchell, just handed us a direct, verifiable bridge into their international financial network. By using stolen funds to route a payment through a shell company directly into their offshore accounts, he just tied them to federal bank fraud. The evidence you compiled here is absolutely bulletproof." The young agent sitting next to him was completely pale, frantically, taking notes on his previously blank pad, desperately trying to catch up to the massive scale of the investigation unfolding right in front of him. Agent Miller stood up abruptly, his mind already racing through tactical logistics. "We need to move on this immediately," he commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "I am going to wake up a federal judge and secure the emergency arrest warrants right now. We will dispatch tactical teams to the residential addresses of both suspects. We can have them in federal custody before noon, and we will initiate emergency freezes on all associated banking accounts." "No," I said loudly, my voice cutting through the rising energy in the room like a cold steel blade. I remained seated, my posture perfectly rigid. "You are not going to arrest them this morning." Agent Miller stopped dead in his tracks, staring down at me in total disbelief. "Richard, they are holding $2 million of your stolen money. We have to secure the suspects before they attempt to flee the jurisdiction. If you raid them right now in their pajamas, their high-priced defense lawyers will tie you up in procedural hearings for years," I explained, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. "They will argue intent. They will claim confusion over the revoked paperwork. I did not spend my entire life building an unassailable financial career just to watch my daughter negotiate a lenient plea deal for a white-collar crime. I want them destroyed. And you want the Las Vegas syndicate. To get both, you have to let them play their final hand." I leaned forward, looking the special agent in charge directly in the eyes. "Wait until tomorrow. Let them get dressed up. Let them host their $300,000 wedding reception. Tomorrow evening during the reception, they are scheduled to execute the final digital authorizations to release the offshore funds to the syndicate proxies. Let them complete the transfers. Catch them with the stolen money actively moving across international borders in real time. If you arrest them while they are actively laundering the capital, you bypass any subjective arguments about intent. It guarantees a mandatory 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole." Agent Miller stared at me, processing the brutal, uncompromising coldness of my demand. He looked down at the dossier and then back up at my unyielding expression. He understood exactly what I was asking him to do. I was asking the federal government to allow my only daughter to walk down the aisle in a stolen wedding dress solely so I could personally ensure she would spend the rest of her natural life locked inside a concrete cage. A slow, deeply respectful nod finally broke his stillness. "Tomorrow evening," Agent Miller agreed softly. "The trap is set." Victor and I walked out of the heavily fortified federal building in complete silence. The bright morning sun was now fully reflecting off the glass towers of the downtown financial district, illuminating a city that was entirely unaware of the massive storm brewing just beneath its surface. We drove back to my dilapidated motel on the outskirts of town. Victor offered to put me up in a luxury hotel, but I firmly declined. I needed the uncomfortable reality of this cheap, sagging mattress. I needed the lingering smell of stale smoke and pine disinfectant to keep my mind sharp and my anger completely focused. We shook hands in the gravel parking lot, a silent acknowledgement between two old friends who had just initiated the destruction of my only remaining family. He promised to coordinate the final tactical logistics with Agent Miller and left me alone to wait out the agonizing hours. By the time night finally fell over the city, the silence in my cramped room was completely deafening. I sat on the edge of the sagging bed listening to the heavy trucks rumbling down the nearby interstate. I reached into the interior pocket of my worn leather briefcase. Hidden beneath the thick stacks of federal indictment papers and fraudulent banking documents was a small faded photograph. I pulled it out and held it under the harsh flickering light of the single bedside lamp. It was a picture taken nearly 20 years ago on the front porch of the house Stephanie had just sold for $10. In the photograph, my late wife Diane was sitting on the wooden swing I had built with my own hands. She was smiling that bright, beautiful smile that could instantly light up a room. Sitting perfectly on her lap was a young, innocent Stephanie wearing a bright yellow sundress and clutching a stuffed bear. I was standing right behind them, my hands resting proudly on Diane's shoulders. We looked like the absolute picture of a perfect, unbreakable American family. I stared at the smiling face of the little girl in the yellow dress. I tried desperately to find a single trace of the cold, calculating woman I had listened to through the audio transmitter last night. I tried to bridge the massive gap between the daughter who used to run to the door when I came home from a long audit and the monster who laughed about leaving me to rot in a state-run medical ward. My thumb gently traced the outline of Diane's face. I thanked God she was not here to witness what our child had become. Diane had spent her entire life teaching our daughter about kindness, integrity, and the sacred bond of family. Stephanie had taken those precious lessons, crumpled them up, and traded them for designer coats and stolen cash. The profound realization washed over me heavy and permanent. The young, innocent girl in this photograph simply did not exist anymore. She had died a long, slow death over the years, gradually consumed by her own toxic greed and her desperate need for superficial status. The woman marrying Derek Mitchell tomorrow was a complete stranger to me. She was a ruthless criminal who viewed my life as nothing more than an expendable resource to fund her own illicit survival. There was absolutely no redemption left for her, and there was no forgiveness left in my heart. I stood up slowly from the edge of the mattress and walked into the small, grimy bathroom. I turned on the exhaust fan to mask the impending smell of smoke. I held the photograph over the stained porcelain sink. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a cheap plastic lighter I had purchased from the gas station, and flicked the flint. A small orange flame danced in the dim light. I brought the fire directly to the bottom corner of the glossy paper. It caught instantly. I watched the flames rapidly consume the bright yellow dress, turning the happy memories into curling black ash. I held it until the fire reached my fingertips, then dropped the burning remains into the damp sink. I turned on the cold water, washing the dark, charred ashes down the rusty metal drain. The past was officially dead. I walked back into the main room and opened the small, flimsy closet. Hanging inside was the only decent piece of clothing I had left in the world. It was a simple, slightly frayed gray two-piece suit. It was the same suit I used to wear during my toughest corporate fraud depositions. I pulled the heavy ironing board out from behind the door and plugged in the sputtering iron. I meticulously pressed every single crease, smoothing out the wrinkled fabric with the exact same slow, deliberate patience I had used to build the federal case against her. I polished my scuffed leather shoes until they shone under the cheap fluorescent lights. I laid out my conservative blue tie across the edge of the desk, aligning it perfectly with my freshly pressed white cotton dress shirt. I was preparing my physical armor for the ultimate confrontation of my entire life. Tomorrow afternoon, 300 of the city's wealthiest elites would gather at a sprawling coastal mansion to celebrate a glamorous wedding financed entirely by my stolen retirement funds. They would drink incredibly expensive imported champagne, eat exquisite gourmet food, and toast to the health of the happy young couple remaining completely oblivious to the massive federal raid about to violently descend upon them. I hung the freshly pressed suit back on the wire hanger, double-checked the iron was unplugged, and carefully set my digital alarm clock for exactly 5 in the early morning. I lay back down on the uncomfortable mattress, pulled the thin blanket over my chest, and closed my eyes in the absolute silent darkness of the room. I was finally ready to peacefully attend a spectacular wedding I was never invited to. The drive from the grim outskirts of Boston to the stunning coastline of Newport, Rhode Island, took just under 2 hours, but it felt like traversing an entire lifetime. I rented a cheap domestic sedan for the day, using the very last of my emergency cash reserves. The weather was frustratingly perfect, almost mocking my internal devastation. The sky was a brilliant blue, and a gentle ocean breeze rolled consistently off the Atlantic waters. It was the exact kind of picturesque afternoon every bride desperately prays for. As I navigated the winding coastal roads lined with ancient oak trees and manicured hedges, the stark contrast between my current reality and the world my daughter was inhabiting became painfully clear. I was a man who had been completely stripped of his home dignity and financial security, driving a vibrating vehicle that smelled faintly of stale coffee. Meanwhile, she was calmly preparing to host a lavish event at one of the most exclusive private estates on the entire eastern seaboard. I had absolutely nothing left to my name except the righteous burning desire for total, absolute, permanent justice. I turned onto a secluded, winding private driveway, paved with crushed white seashells that crunched loudly beneath my worn tires. A discreet wrought iron sign indicated I had arrived at the sprawling oceanfront mansion Derek had rented for the weekend. The sheer scale of the property was staggering to witness. It was a massive architectural masterpiece built during the Gilded Age, featuring towering stone columns, expansive wrap around terraces, and perfectly sculpted botanical gardens that sloped directly down to the crashing waves of the ocean. I slowly pulled my scratched 10-year-old rental car into the designated guest parking area. The valet attendants, impeccably dressed in crisp white uniforms, actually hesitated for a confused second when they saw my unassuming vehicle approaching. The designated parking lot looked exactly like a luxury European car dealership. I deliberately wedged my dusty sedan directly between a gleaming black Ferrari and a brand new silver Porsche. I turned off the struggling engine, stepped out into the salty sea air, and carefully buttoned my frayed gray suit jacket. I did not bother handing my keys to the confused valet. I began my steady walk up the sweeping stone pathway toward the main residence. Every single step I took revealed another sickening layer of stolen extravagance. The expansive lawns were fully covered with massive white silk tents. Dozens of synchronized waiters moving with practiced grace carried heavy silver trays loaded entirely with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and delicate spoons of imported caviar. There were incredibly intricate floral arrangements cascading beautifully down every stone staircase, featuring thousands of rare white orchids that must have cost an absolute fortune to import. 300 of the city's most elite socialites, wealthy investors, and powerful corporate executives were casually mingling in the warm afternoon sun. The women wore glittering designer gowns, and the men sported sharply tailored silk suits. They laughed warmly with one another, completely and blissfully ignorant of the horrifying fact that the exquisite wine they were currently drinking and the beautiful flowers they were admiring were purchased entirely with the stolen retirement funds of a 70-year-old man. This entire fairy tale setting was built on a crumbling foundation of absolute betrayal and massive federal wire fraud. As I confidently approached the grand entrance of the main mansion, I immediately noticed a dense, highly organized perimeter of private security guards. They were incredibly large, imposing men wearing dark sunglasses and discreet communication earpieces, strictly checking digital guest invitations on glowing tablet computers. A normal, uninvited guest would have nervously hesitated, averting their eyes, slowing their pace, and awkwardly fumbling for a believable excuse to bypass the checkpoint. That exact kind of fearful behavior instantly triggers a rapid security response. But I had spent 40 years confidently walking into highly hostile corporate boardrooms and aggressively taking absolute control of incredibly tense financial audits. I possessed the absolute unshakable confidence of a man who literally had nothing left in the world to lose. I did not slow my pace for a single second. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my chin held incredibly high, and my eyes locked dead ahead on the entryway. I walked directly through the dense crowd of wealthy guests, projecting a powerful aura of absolute undeniable authority. When I reached the main security checkpoint, I did not stop walking. I did not offer a fabricated name. I simply gave the towering lead guard a sharp, highly impatient nod and walked right past him. My sheer arrogant confidence completely bypassed their rigorous protocols. They naturally assumed I was an eccentric, wealthy uncle or a highly respected senior dignitary who was simply above the normal rules. I stepped into the cool, dark marble foyer of the historic mansion. The distant sound of a live string quartet drifted through the expansive hallways. I followed the beautiful classical music, my leather shoes clicking softly against the polished stone floor. I navigated through the labyrinth of opulent rooms until I finally reached the entrance of the grand ballroom, where the actual ceremony was scheduled to take place. The entrance was guarded by two massive, intricately carved oak doors. They were currently pulled tightly shut, indicating that the bridal procession had already begun. I stood entirely alone in the incredibly quiet, empty hallway, taking one final deep breath. I reached out and firmly grasped the heavy brass handles. With one swift, powerful motion, I pushed both of the heavy oak doors wide open. The heavy wood groaned loudly on its brass hinges, echoing like a sudden clap of thunder. I stepped squarely into the center of the doorway, the bright afternoon sunlight streaming in from the hallway behind me, casting a long dark shadow down the center aisle. The beautiful sweeping melody of the string quartet instantly sputtered and died. Complete absolute and utter silence violently crashed down over the massive crowded room. Every head in the massive opulent ballroom turned simultaneously toward the sudden thunderous noise. 300 pairs of eyes shifted away from the altar and locked directly onto me. The lavish space was an absolute cathedral of stolen wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, romantic glow over the sea of seated guests. At the very front of the room, standing beneath an elaborate archway, woven entirely of white roses, was my daughter. Stephanie was draped in a breathtaking custom-designed silk and lace wedding gown that Victor's investigator had explicitly confirmed cost a staggering $40,000. It was a dress fit for royalty paid for entirely with the sweat off my back. For a fraction of a second, the entire room was frozen in a state of confused suspension. Then the shock on Stephanie's face rapidly melted into an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. Her perfectly manicured features twisted into a grotesque mask of fury and deep embarrassment. The pristine facade of the elegant bride was instantly shattered by the unexpected arrival of her discarded father. I stepped over the threshold and began to walk slowly and deliberately down the very long center aisle. The thick white runner felt plush beneath my scuffed leather shoes. Whispers immediately began to ripple through the wealthy crowd, like a sudden gust of wind through dry leaves. Guests leaned into one another, exchanging confused and scandalized murmurs as I passed their rows. I ignored every single one of them. My eyes remained completely locked on the altar. Derek, standing rigidly next to his furious bride in a bespoke tuxedo, looked absolutely terrified. The manufactured confidence of the supposed crypto-millionaire completely evaporated the moment he saw me marching toward them. He instinctively took a half-step backward before catching himself and puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of false bravado. He stepped aggressively down from the elevated altar, moving to block my path just a few feet away from the floral arch. "Listen to me very carefully," Old Man Derek threatened, his voice dropping into a desperate, shaking whisper meant only for my ears. "You need to turn around and walk right back out those doors this exact second. If you take one more step, I am going to have my private security team drag you out of here by your throat and throw you directly into the ocean. You are trespassing on private property." Before I could even formulate a response to his completely empty threat, Stephanie aggressively pushed past her terrified groom. She stood directly in front of me, her face flushed dark red with absolute anger. She leaned in incredibly close, her expensive imported perfume completely overpowering the sweet scent of the fresh roses. "What are you doing here?" she hissed viciously through tightly gritted teeth, her voice dripping with pure venom. "I specifically told you to stay in that miserable motel and rot. You are completely ruining my perfect day. You are humiliating me in front of all of my incredibly important friends. Security, somebody get the security team in here right now and violently remove this crazy old man." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or react to her hateful words in any way. I simply looked at the woman who used to be my beloved daughter with a cold, hollow emptiness that finally matched the dark void she had ruthlessly carved into my own chest. I gently but firmly pushed my way right past both of them. I stepped gracefully up onto the elevated marble altar, completely ignoring the deeply confused and highly uncomfortable priest who was standing nervously to the side. I reached out and calmly pulled the wireless microphone from the heavy metal stand positioned for the wedding readings. I turned around to face the massive sea of shocked faces. The frantic murmurs in the crowd instantly died down. The entire ballroom held its collective breath in absolute terrifying silence, waiting anxiously to see exactly what the disheveled man in the frayed gray suit was about to do. "I sincerely apologize for the dramatic interruption," I said calmly, my voice projecting clearly through the massive state-of-the-art sound system. "I know that my sudden arrival is highly unorthodox. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Richard Brooks. I am the biological father of the beautiful bride." A collective audible gasp swept intensely through the rows of elite guests. Eyes darted frantically between my worn, frayed clothing and Stephanie's wildly extravagant gown. "Please do not panic," I continued, my tone remaining perfectly even and entirely conversational. "I am absolutely not here to object to this beautiful union. In fact, I think Derek and Stephanie are a truly perfect match for one another. Two incredible people. I am simply here to ask for a remarkably small favor. I am just here to get a proper itemized receipt for the $2 million my lovely daughter stole from me yesterday afternoon to pay for this spectacular party." The reaction was explosive. 300 people gasped simultaneously in absolute unfiltered shock. Several wealthy women actually covered their mouths in genuine horror. The heavy, oppressive silence was completely shattered by a chaotic eruption of horrified whispers and incredibly sudden exclamations. It was truly magnificent. I watched the crowd lose their refined composure. Stephanie frantically scrambled up the marble stairs of the altar, her face now completely pale with sudden, overwhelming panic. She grabbed Derek's arm, desperately trying to play the completely innocent victim to her wealthy friends. "Do not listen to him," she shouted frantically over the rising noise of the crowd, her voice cracking with heavily manufactured hysteria. "He is completely senile. He is suffering from severe dementia. He does not know what he is saying. I have a perfectly legal power of attorney." I stood my ground and smiled a freezing smile. "Did you check the date on it, sweetheart?" Before my daughter could even begin to process the devastating weight of my question, before she could formulate another desperate lie to feed the horrified crowd, the heavy atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The crystal pendants of the massive chandeliers hanging above us began to vibrate softly, clinking together in a strange, chaotic rhythm. A low, rhythmic thudding sound rapidly grew in intensity, vibrating through the solid marble floor beneath our feet. It was the unmistakable, deafening roar of heavy helicopter blades chopping through the coastal wind. The wealthy guests looked up in sheer panic. Suddenly, the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors that lined the back of the ballroom, offering a perfect view of the ocean, were completely illuminated by violently flashing red and blue lights. Through the sheer white drapery, I watched as a fleet of heavy black tactical vehicles tore directly across the immaculate, manicured botanical gardens. The massive tires ripped up the perfect green grass, destroying the delicate flower beds as they formed a strict perimeter around the entire estate. The heavy oak doors I had just walked through were violently thrown wide open. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical gear and heavy body armor swarmed into the elegant ballroom. The bright yellow letters printed across their tactical vests confirmed their absolute authority. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, immediately securing every single exit and blocking the sweeping marble staircases. A voice boomed through a heavy megaphone, completely overpowering the panicked screams of the elite wedding guests. "Federal agents," the voice roared. "Nobody move. Stay exactly where you are." The absolute terror that washed over Derek's face was a beautiful thing to witness. He knew instantly that his elaborate house of cards had completely collapsed. Whether he believed it was the federal government or the violent Las Vegas gambling syndicate coming to collect his $2 million debt, his primal instinct for selfish survival immediately kicked in. Without a single moment of hesitation, without even looking back at the woman he was about to marry, the cowardly groom completely abandoned his bride. He turned sharply on his heel and sprinted frantically toward the swinging wooden doors that led to the catering kitchen. He did not make it very far. As he desperately pushed his way through the screaming, terrified wedding guests, a specialized tactical team breached the kitchen doors directly in front of him. Derek panicked, attempting to sharply change his trajectory, but the leather soles of his bespoke tuxedo shoes slipped wildly on the highly polished marble floor. A massive federal agent lunged forward, tackling Derek squarely in the center of his chest. The sheer momentum of the brutal impact launched both men directly into the center of the room, sending them crashing spectacularly through the towering $10,000 imported champagne pyramid. The sound of hundreds of delicate crystal flutes exploding simultaneously echoed like shattering ice. Extremely expensive vintage champagne sprayed everywhere, raining down over the terrified guests and soaking into the thick white runner. Derek lay completely dazed amidst the massive pile of broken glass and spilled alcohol, his expensive suit ruined. The federal agents immediately flipped him onto his stomach, driving a heavy knee directly into his spine and tightly secured his wrists with thick plastic zip ties. He whimpered pathetically, offering absolutely no physical resistance. Back at the elevated altar, Stephanie was completely frozen, in a state of catatonic shock. She stood entirely alone beneath the archway of white roses, her eyes darting frantically around the chaotic ballroom. Special Agent Miller calmly stepped up the marble stairs, bypassing the cowering priest, and walked directly toward my daughter. He did not look like an apologetic wedding guest. He looked exactly like the seasoned, relentless federal hunter I knew him to be. He pulled a thick, tightly folded legal document from the inside pocket of his dark suit jacket. Stephanie finally snapped out of her frozen trance. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Agent Miller, her voice pitching into a hysterical, piercing scream. "Get out of my wedding!" she shrieked, her face stained with ruined makeup. "You have absolutely no right to be here. You are ruining everything. I have legal rights. I have a perfectly legal power of attorney for that money. It was a family transaction. You cannot touch me." Agent Miller did not even blink at her frantic, delusional outburst. He calmly unfolded the federal arrest warrant and looked her directly in the eyes. "Stephanie Brooks," he stated, his deep voice carrying a terrifying official finality. "You are under arrest by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are being officially charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and severe bank fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and absolutely will be used against you in a federal court of law." As he calmly recited the remainder of her Miranda rights, a female tactical agent stepped forward. She forcefully grabbed Stephanie by her delicate, trembling arms and pulled them roughly behind her back. The cold, heavy steel of the federal handcuffs clicked loudly and tightly over her expensive white silk gloves. The stark, brutal contrast of the iron chains resting against the delicate lace of her $40,000 custom bridal gown was the absolute picture of poetic justice. The reality of the federal prison sentence finally shattered her arrogant delusion. The anger entirely drained from her face, replaced by absolute whimpering terror. As the agents began to physically drag her away from the altar, she looked back at me. Tears streamed rapidly down her face. She was sobbing uncontrollably, the facade of the cruel mastermind completely broken. "Daddy, please," she begged, her voice cracking with desperate, pathetic panic. "Tell them you gave it to me. Please save me. Daddy, do not let them take me." I stood perfectly still on the marble altar, entirely untouched by the absolute chaos raging throughout the massive ballroom. I looked down at the sobbing, broken woman who had willingly chosen to sacrifice my entire life for a pile of stolen cash and a worthless criminal. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no regret, no lingering sorrow. The ledger was finally balanced. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion whatsoever. "Good luck." 6 months later, the extravagant coastal sunshine of Newport was nothing more than a distant, bitter memory. I sat completely motionless on a hard wooden bench in the gallery of a federal courtroom in downtown Boston. The room was sterile, heavily paneled in dark mahogany, and completely devoid of any warmth or comfort. The air smelled of old paper industrial floor wax, and quiet desperation. It was the absolute antithesis of a fairy tale wedding. I wore the exact same frayed gray suit I had worn on the day of the raid. Over the past 6 months, the federal wheels of justice had turned with a slow, grinding inevitability that completely crushed everything in their path. The explosive events of that afternoon had sent absolute shockwaves through the local elite social circles, but inside this quiet courtroom, it was just another day of prosecuting organized crime. I sat alone, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling entirely emotionless as I waited patiently for the final gavel to fall. The burning anger had finally burned out, leaving only a vast, incredibly quiet emptiness in my soul. The prosecution's case had been an absolute masterpiece of forensic accounting, heavily built upon the massive 50-page dossier I had meticulously prepared. Because Special Agent Miller had perfectly timed the raid, the massive international wire transfers were physically frozen by federal authorities while they were completely mid-flight across the global banking network. The stolen funds never successfully reached the shadowy offshore escrow account in Dubai. Furthermore, the massive digital footprint left behind by the panicked transaction provided the Federal Bureau of Investigation with the exact entry point they desperately needed to completely dismantle the violent Las Vegas gambling syndicate. Derek Mitchell's carefully constructed illusion of wealth was utterly obliterated. His high-priced defense attorneys attempted to negotiate a desperate plea deal, but the sheer volume of his financial crimes left them with absolutely no legal leverage whatsoever. When the federal judge finally handed down his sentence, Derek stood trembling in a bright orange jumpsuit, completely broken. He was formally sentenced to exactly 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. He did not dare to look back at the gallery as the armed bailiffs violently escorted him out of the silent courtroom. Then it was my daughter's turn to face the absolute reality of her devastating actions. Stephanie was escorted into the courtroom wearing a standard-issue beige prison uniform, a stark and humiliating contrast to the $40,000 custom silk gown she had worn the very last time we were in the exact same room. Her hair was completely unkempt, and she had lost a significant amount of weight. When she took the witness stand, she immediately launched into a deeply rehearsed, highly emotional performance. She wept uncontrollably, desperately, attempting to play the role of the innocent, incredibly naive victim. She passionately claimed that Derek had completely manipulated her fragile emotional state. She swore under oath that she honestly believed my medical condition was rapidly deteriorating and that she was only trying to protect my financial legacy. She looked directly across the courtroom at me, her eyes completely filled with desperate, begging tears. She pleaded publicly for my forgiveness, loudly asking the federal judge to consider her previously clean criminal record and her deep remorse. She begged me to save her one last time, completely ignoring the reality of her own choices. The federal prosecutor respectfully approached the bench and formally asked if I had prepared a victim impact statement or a letter requesting judicial leniency for my only child. In many domestic fraud cases, the betrayed family members ultimately break down and beg the court for a suspended sentence. The entire courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, waiting for the grieving father to finally show a sliver of mercy. I slowly stood up from the hard wooden bench. I looked directly into Stephanie's terrified, tear-filled eyes. I did not speak a single word. I simply looked at the judge, gave a firm, definitive shake of my head, and sat right back down. I actively refused to offer even a single syllable of leniency. I would not allow her manufactured tears to erase the cold, sociopathic malice I had heard clearly through that hidden audio transmitter. She had made her choice in that expensive restaurant, and now she was going to pay the ultimate price. I felt absolutely nothing for the desperate woman crying on the witness stand. The federal judge adjusted his glasses, looking down at my daughter with absolute, unyielding sternness. He explicitly noted the highly predatory nature of her crime, emphasizing how she had maliciously weaponized a medical emergency to completely ruin her own father. He struck his massive, heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. He officially sentenced Stephanie Brooks to exactly 8 years in federal prison. As she suddenly collapsed into hysterical, uncontrollable sobbing, she was forcefully dragged out of the courtroom by 2 armed marshals. The agonizing and incredibly long federal trial process was finally and completely over. Over the next few weeks, the federal government systematically reversed every single fraudulent transaction. My entire retirement fund was legally unfrozen and fully restored directly to my personal banking accounts. The illicit commercial deed of trust was officially voided, and the original deed to the Boston property was permanently returned to my name. I had successfully won the war and recovered every single penny that was stolen from me. But as I finally drove back to that quiet suburban street and parked in my own driveway, staring at the front door where I was once locked out, a profound and heavy realization washed over me. I had successfully gotten my house back, but I knew with absolute certainty that I could never actually live in it again. The dark, lingering ghosts of her horrific betrayal were permanently trapped inside those familiar walls. I stood in the exact center of the living room, completely surrounded by the cold, heavy, and suffocating silence of the empty suburban house that I once loved. Every single corner of this massive building held a deeply cherished family memory, but those precious memories had been irreversibly tainted by the cruel, calculating malice of what my daughter had aggressively and heartlessly attempted to do. I realized that a true home is not simply constructed from wooden beams, drywall, and cold stone. It is fundamentally built upon an unbreakable foundation of mutual trust, deep respect, and unconditional love. Once that sacred foundation is completely shattered by an unforgivable betrayal, the walls can no longer protect you from the outside world. They only serve as a dark, suffocating prison of incredibly painful reminders. I did not waste any more time silently mourning the devastating loss of the physical property. I immediately contacted a highly reputable, legally licensed real estate broker in the downtown area. We professionally staged the rooms and listed the 4-bedroom house on the open, highly competitive market. Because the property title had been officially and permanently cleared by the federal court order completely voiding the fraudulent transfer to Derek's shell company, the property sold legitimately to a wonderful young family in less than 3 weeks. When the final closing documents were officially signed at the lawyer's office and the clean funds were securely deposited directly into my private bank account, I finally felt a profound, heavy physical weight lift entirely off my tired shoulders. I knew exactly what I desperately needed to do with that massive influx of cash. I had absolutely no desire to greedily hoard the newfound wealth or let it sit idle in a sterile, impersonal banking institution. I wanted to actively transform the highly toxic energy of her massive betrayal into something radiating with permanent, undeniable light. I took a very substantial portion of the cash generated from the legitimate real estate sale and formally established a fully funded collegiate scholarship program at the prestigious university where my late wife had originally studied. I proudly named it the Diane Brooks Memorial Endowment. It was specifically designed to continuously provide full, unrestricted academic tuition for underprivileged, highly driven young women actively pursuing advanced degrees in special education and clinical social work. Diane had spent her entire beautiful life selflessly helping others, and now her incredible legacy would continue to financially support brilliant, highly deserving students long after I was permanently gone from this earth. As I proudly signed the final legal endowment papers sitting in the university president's grand office, I genuinely felt Diane's warm, deeply comforting presence standing right beside me. I had successfully and fiercely protected her untarnished memory from the disgraceful, destructive greed of the criminal child we had raised together. With my fully restored retirement funds and the remaining capital from the house sale, I made a sudden lifestyle decision that genuinely surprised even my oldest friend, Victor. I absolutely did not buy a smaller house in the suburbs, nor did I rent a luxury condominium in the crowded city center. Instead, I walked onto a premium dealership lot and purchased a massive state-of-the-art luxury recreational vehicle. It was a breathtaking rolling sanctuary, completely equipped with a beautiful modern kitchen, a highly comfortable master bedroom, and incredibly large panoramic windows, specifically designed to take in the vast beauty of the natural world. I methodically packed only my absolute daily essentials, intentionally leaving behind decades of accumulated, completely unnecessary physical baggage. I handed Victor a spare set of secure keys to my remaining financial lockboxes, shook his strong hand one final time in the law firm parking lot, and drove the massive vehicle straight out of the Boston city limits. I drove continuously for several days, happily leaving the cold, haunting memories of the East Coast far behind in my rearview mirror. I quietly watched the dark green forests transition into the golden agricultural plains of the Midwest, and finally into the majestic red rock formations of the American Southwest. Right now, as I speak these words to you, I am driving steadily down a remarkably beautiful, completely sunlit highway, stretching endlessly across the vast painted deserts of Arizona. The sky directly above my windshield is an endless expanse of bright, cloudless blue. The long road ahead of me is completely open, completely free, and entirely mine to conquer. As I comfortably grip the warm leather steering wheel, I finally have ample, uninterrupted time to reflect deeply on the incredibly painful, complex concepts of blood family loyalty and ultimate betrayal. Modern society constantly dictates that we must unconditionally love, financially support, and fiercely protect our family members, simply because we share the exact same genetic code. But biology is absolutely not a free pass to inflict endless psychological torture and severe financial abuse upon the very people who sacrificed everything to raise you. My daughter and her criminal fiancé looked at my gray hair and mistakenly saw profound, exploitable weakness. They arrogantly thought that my advancing age had made me completely blind to their incredibly dark, highly treacherous financial schemes. They completely forgot that age made me incredibly patient. I spent 4 decades meticulously learning how to wait quietly, in the cold shadows, until the absolute perfect moment finally presented itself to strike back with complete, undeniable precision. The young and arrogant will always eventually stumble over their own foolish, hurried greed, leaving behind a massive trail of careless mistakes for someone like me to easily find. I lost a daughter, but I kept my dignity. Some say I was too cold, that a father should always forgive. But I believe forgiveness without justice is just an invitation to be abused again. Was I right to send her to federal prison? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you believe in justice over toxic bloodlines, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story. The most profound lesson to extract from this difficult journey is that true respect and loyalty are earned through continuous actions, not simply inherited through biology. Never allow the powerful guilt of familial duty to force you into accepting blatant abuse or financial manipulation. Boundaries are absolutely essential for your own emotional survival, regardless of who is standing on the other side of the line. Protecting your peace and your dignity is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of fundamental self-preservation. Do not forget to hit the like button and share this video with anyone who needs to hear this truth today.